"My adopted son will be the sole heir to this estate," my father said, his voice as cold as the silver platter on the mahogany table. He slid the legal folder toward me with a finality that made the air in the room feel thin. I didn't cry. I didn't even flinch. I just looked at the man who had watched me break my back for 10 years, managing the finances of this horse farm while he wallowed in his own past. I glanced at the man sitting next to him, the son he'd taken in out of some twisted sense of debt, who was currently wearing a smug, practiced look of sympathy. I laughed, the sound sharp and echoing against the portraits of my ancestors. "I've been the one keeping this place from bankruptcy, Dad. I'm the one who knows every bloodline in the stables. And you think he deserves the legacy my mother built?" He didn't look at me. He just patted the younger man's shoulder. "He's shown me the loyalty you never could, Cassidy. He stays. You're done." That was the moment I pulled a single, notarized sheet of paper from my blazer pocket and laid it over his new will. I watched his eyes scan the header. I watched his face turn from arrogant to a ghostly, sickly white. His hands started to shake, the paper rattling in his grip. "How do you have this?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "Why would you do this?" I leaned in, my shadow falling over the document that changed everything. "Because I'm my mother's daughter, and unlike you, I actually read the fine print. The betrayal was deep, but my countermove was deeper. If you want to see how I took back my legacy and left them with nothing, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss how this family war ends." The crisp morning air of Lexington used to smell like Kentucky bluegrass and fresh hope, but that changed 10 years ago when the heart of this farm stopped beating. My mother, Pearl Harrington, didn't just own the land. She was the soul that kept the stables running and the family together. When she passed away, the silence that followed was heavier than any grief I had ever known. I was only 16, standing by the white paddock fences, watching my father, Lawrence Harrington, stare blankly at the empty track where she used to train our prize stallions. For months, he was a shell of a man, neglecting the books and letting the prestige of the Harrington estate slide into the mud. I stepped up then, balancing my schoolwork with the messy ledgers of the farm, trying to preserve the legacy my mother had bled for. I thought we were healing, slowly finding a new rhythm in the quiet, until a dusty black sedan pulled up the gravel driveway on a Tuesday afternoon. Lawrence stood on the porch, his eyes lighting up for the first time in a year as a young man stepped out of the car. He looked older than me, maybe 18, with an air of forced humility that immediately made the hair on my arms stand up. "Cassidy, come meet Bennett Miller," my father called out, his voice trembling with an excitement I hadn't heard in ages. He explained that Bennett was the son of an old military friend who had died in a tragic accident, leaving the boy with no one and nothing. Lawrence claimed he owed Bennett's father a debt of honor that could only be repaid by giving the boy a home. I watched as they shook hands, Bennett offering a firm, respectful grip that seemed a little too rehearsed for a grieving orphan. Lawrence didn't just offer him a room, he offered him a place at the table, treating him like a long-lost piece of our fractured family. Within the first month, the subtle shifts began. Bennett didn't just help out, he inserted himself into every corner of my father's life, becoming the son Lawrence never had. One evening, I walked toward the stables to check on my favorite mare, Luna, only to find the stall empty. I found Bennett out in the training ring, pushing Luna far past her limit under the scorching sun. When I told him to stop, he didn't apologize or back down. Instead, he wiped the sweat from his brow and looked me dead in the eye with a cold, piercing gaze that didn't match his polite persona. "Your father told me I should take charge of the morning drills, Cassidy," he said, his voice smooth and devoid of warmth. I turned to see Lawrence standing by the gate, nodding in approval as if Bennett had done something heroic. My father didn't see the exhaustion in the horse's eyes or the disrespect in Bennett's tone. He only saw a strong young man who was willing to get his hands dirty. That was the first time I felt like a stranger on my own land, watching a newcomer slowly tighten his grip on the reins of our life. By the time I returned from college with a degree in agricultural business, the Harrington farm had undergone a chilling transformation that no one but me seemed to notice. The white fences were still pristine, and the bluegrass still rolled like emerald waves, but the hierarchy of our home had been rewritten in my absence. Bennett Miller wasn't just a guest anymore. He had become the shadow that moved whenever my father breathed. Lawrence had aged rapidly. his eyes clouded by a strange mix of pride and dependency as he watched Bennett handle the yearling auctions with a practiced, silver-tongued charm. I walked into the main office on my first day back, expecting to take my place at the desk my mother had used for 20 years, only to find Bennett's leather satchel resting on her mahogany surface. He didn't even look up from the ledger, his fingers tapping a rhythmic, annoying beat against the wood as he reviewed the quarterly earnings. "I've already streamlined the payroll, Cassidy," he said, his voice flat and devoid of any welcome. He finally leaned back, gesturing vaguely to a small, cramped desk in the corner of the room, far away from the window that overlooked the training track. "Lawrence thought it would be best if you handled the back-end compliance and taxes. He thinks the heavy lifting of the horse trade is better suited for someone with more physical presence." The implication was as sharp as a spur, suggesting that because I was a woman, my role was to be hidden away in a mountain of paperwork while he played the part of the heir apparent. I didn't argue then, choosing instead to focus on the numbers, which was where I first began to see the cracks in the foundation Bennett was building. Dinner at the Harrington estate became a theater of exclusion, where my father and Bennett spoke a language of horseflesh and betting odds that purposefully left me on the sidelines. Lawrence would lean in, his face glowing as Bennett recounted stories of the backstretch at Churchill Downs, laughing at jokes I wasn't meant to understand. When I tried to bring up the rising costs of grain or the suspicious dip in our insurance premiums, my father would simply wave a hand in dismissal. "Not now, Cassidy. Don't ruin a good meal with spreadsheets. Bennett has a gut feeling about the next Triple Crown contender, and I trust his instincts more than your calculators." The sting of his words wasn't just about the business, it was the realization that he was choosing a stranger's gut over his own daughter's expertise. The physical divide grew even wider during the spring breeding season. I found myself barred from the inner stables, the very place where I had learned to walk. One afternoon, I tried to enter the barn to check on a foal that had been struggling with a respiratory infection, only to find the heavy oak doors locked from the inside. I pounded on the wood until Bennett opened it, his shirt stained with sweat and hay. He didn't move aside to let me in. He simply stood in the gap, blocking my view. "Lawrence and I decided to keep the staff to a minimum during the recovery phase," he stated, his tone dripping with a fake professional concern. "We don't need too many cooks in the kitchen, Cassidy. Go back to your office and make sure the invoices are paid." I looked past him and saw my father standing by the foal's stall, his back turned to me, completely absorbed in whatever lie Bennett was spinning that day. The silence from Lawrence was louder than any shout. It was the sound of a gate slamming shut on my life at Harrington Farm. The tension at Harrington Farm finally snapped on a humid July afternoon when the screams of a thoroughbred stallion tore through the heavy Kentucky air. I ran toward the north paddock, my heart hammering against my ribs, only to find our prize 3-year-old, Midnight Storm, thrashing on the ground with a jagged gash across his flank. The gate to the jagged limestone quarry, a restricted area, had been left wide open. Before I could even reach the horse, Bennett Miller was already there, his face a mask of calculated horror as he looked at my father, Lawrence Harrington, who had just arrived in his truck. Bennett didn't wait for a question. He pointed a trembling finger toward the office where I spent my days. I told her, "Lawrence." I told Cassidy that the north gate needed a new heavy-duty bolt, but she said the budget couldn't handle the extra expense this month. I stood there, paralyzed by the sheer audacity of the lie. I had never seen a request for a new bolt, and the budget for maintenance was the one thing I never touched without my father's direct signature. "That's a lie, Bennett," I snapped, my voice shaking with a mix of fury and fear for the animal. "I haven't seen a single requisition form for that gate in 6 months." But Lawrence wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the blood on the grass, his eyes brimming with the kind of disappointment that kills a relationship. He didn't ask for proof or check the files. He just turned his back on me to help Bennett stabilize the horse. "Your numbers are starting to cost me more than money, Cassidy," he muttered, his voice thick, with a resentment that had been festering for years. "Go back to the house. I can't look at you right now." The betrayal followed me into the evening when I found Bennett in the main hall, leaning over a set of architectural blueprints spread across the dining table. They weren't just any plans, they were for the complete renovation of my mother's private conservatory, the one place on this farm that still smelled of her jasmine perfume and held her original sketches of the estate. Bennett was highlighting sections to be demolished to make room for a modern trophy room and a private lounge for high-stakes gamblers. "Lawrence and I think it's time to move past the sentimentality of the past, Cassidy," he said, not even looking up as he marked a red X over my mother's favorite reading nook. "The Harrington name needs to be associated with winning, not with a shrine to someone who's been gone for a decade." I snatched the pen from his hand, my knuckles white. "You have no right to touch this room. This was my mother's legacy, Pearl's heart. My father would never agree to tear this down." Just then, Lawrence walked in, the smell of stable hay and antiseptic clinging to his clothes. He looked exhausted, but his gaze sharpened when it landed on me. I expected him to defend the memory of his late wife, but instead, he walked over and placed a supportive hand on Bennett's shoulder. "I gave him the green light, Cassidy. That conservatory is a tomb, and I'm tired of living in a graveyard. Bennett is right, we need to modernize if we're going to survive the next racing season." The coldness in his tone was a physical blow. He wasn't just renovating a room, he was systematically erasing the only person who had ever truly loved him, all to satisfy the ego of a man he barely knew. I realized then that Bennett wasn't just trying to win the farm, he was trying to replace me in my father's DNA. "You're letting him destroy everything Mom worked for," I whispered, my voice thick with a grief that felt like it was drowning me. Lawrence didn't flinch. He just leaned over the blueprints, his finger tracing the lines of Bennett's new vision. "Nonsense. He's the only one looking forward. You're the only one standing in the way of our future." The silence of the Harrington estate at 3 a.m. was thick with the scent of old paper and rain-soaked cedar. I found myself in my father's private study, a room I usually avoided because it felt more like Bennett's territory every day. I wasn't there to spy. I was looking for the property tax receipts for the lower pastures that I needed to file before the week's end. But as I tugged at a jammed drawer in Lawrence's heavy oak desk, a hidden compartment clicked open, revealing a manila envelope with the embossed seal of a law firm I didn't recognize. My breath hitched as I saw the words "Last Will and Testament, Final Draft" printed across the top in a stark, unforgiving font. I sat on the floor, the cold floorboards pressing against my legs, as I began to read. My hands shook so violently that the paper rattled like dry leaves in a storm. My father hadn't just updated his will, he had systematically dismantled my entire future. In clear, legal prose, he had designated Bennett Miller as the primary beneficiary of the Harrington Horse Farm, including the breeding rights to every stallion we owned, and the 300 acres of prime Kentucky soil that had been in my mother's family for 4 generations. I searched for my name, my eyes blurring with tears of disbelief, only to find it buried in a minor clause. I was to receive a small cash settlement, $100,000, and a collection of my mother's personal jewelry. It was a parting gift, a consolation prize meant to usher me out the door while a stranger took the keys to my kingdom. The most agonizing part wasn't the loss of the money, it was the date on the document. Lawrence had initiated these changes 6 months ago, right around the time he started calling Bennett his right hand and telling the neighbors how lucky he was to finally have a real cattleman on the property. While I was staying up late, balancing the books and fighting to keep our reputation intact, my father was sitting in a mahogany office downtown, quietly erasing me from his life. He was giving Bennett the very thing I had spent my entire life protecting, handed over on a silver platter because of a misplaced sense of loyalty to a dead friend's son. As I flipped to the final page, a smaller, handwritten note fell out. It was in my father's shaky, aging script, addressed to Bennett. "I hope this gives you the fresh start you deserve. Cassidy has always been too much like Pearl, stiff, focused on the past, unable to see the vision we share. This farm needs your fire, not her ledgers." The words felt like a physical assault, a betrayal that went deeper than any legal document could reach. He didn't just want to give the farm to Bennett. He actively wanted to remove my influence, viewing my dedication to my mother's standards as a hindrance rather than a strength. I heard a floorboard creak in the hallway and froze, shoving the envelope back into the compartment just as the shadows shifted outside the door. I didn't have the receipts I came for, but I had something far more dangerous: the truth. I realized that the man sleeping down the hall wasn't the father who had taught me to ride. He was a stranger who had been bought and paid for by Bennett's calculated flattery. I leaned my head against the cold wood of the desk, realizing that if I didn't find a way to stop this, the Harrington name would be nothing more than a memory by the next racing season. The fire my father praised in Bennett was actually a blaze intended to burn our history to the ground, and I was the only one left to pour the water. The confrontation didn't happen in the quiet of the night. It happened in the middle of the afternoon, right in the center of the horse training ring, where the entire staff could see. Lawrence Harrington stood there, his face a deep shade of crimson, holding a stack of bank statements that Bennett Miller had clearly discovered on my desk. Bennett stood a few feet behind him, his arms crossed, wearing an expression of feigned disappointment that made my stomach churn. $5,000, Cassidy, my father shouted, his voice cracking with a mixture of betrayal and exhaustion. $5,000 missing from the emergency medical fund for the mares, and your signature is on every single withdrawal slip from the last 3 months. I didn't even bother looking at the papers. I knew Bennett had spent weeks perfecting my signature, mimicking the way I looped the C in Cassidy, just as he had mimicked my father's affection. I didn't take that money, Lawrence. You know I've been putting my own salary back into this farm to keep the fences painted and the grain silos full. But my words were like pebbles thrown against a stone wall. Lawrence didn't want the truth. He wanted a reason to justify the diabolical will I had seen in his desk. He wanted me gone so he could stop feeling guilty about replacing me with a stranger who told him exactly what he wanted to hear. I'm done listening to the excuses, Lawrence said, his voice dropping to a cold, flat whisper that hurt worse than the shouting. I want you off this property by sunset. Hand over your keys to the main house and the office. Bennett will be taking over the accounts effective immediately. I looked at the man who had raised me, searching for a glimmer of the father who used to lift me onto my first pony, but there was nothing left but a shell of a man controlled by a master manipulator. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the heavy brass ring of keys, dropping them into the dirt at his feet. I wouldn't give Bennett the satisfaction of a hand-to-hand exchange. The next 3 hours were a blur of heartache as I packed 10 years of my life into 6 cardboard boxes. Bennett followed me from room to room, leaning against the door frames with a predatory grin that he only showed when Lawrence was out of earshot. When I reached for the silver-framed photograph of my mother, Pearl, that sat on the mantel, his hand shot out to stop me. That stays here, Cassidy. The house was part of the Harrington estate long before you were born, and everything inside it belongs to the farm now. Your father's orders. I shoved his hand away, my eyes blazing with a fury that finally made him flinch. This is my mother's face, Bennett. You can steal the land, and you can steal my father's mind, but you will never touch her memory. I hauled the boxes to my old truck, the engine coughing as I started it for the last time on this driveway. As I pulled away, I saw Lawrence standing on the porch, his shadow long and lonely against the white wood of the house. He didn't wave goodbye. He didn't even look up when the gravel kicked up behind my tires. I drove straight to the outskirts of Lexington, to the small stone cottage where my maternal grandparents, Dorothy and Walter, lived. They were the ones who had given Pearl the land in the first place, and they were the only ones left who remembered that a Harrington without a Harrington woman was just a man lost in the weeds. As I stepped onto their porch, the weight of the betrayal finally broke me, but through the tears, a cold, hard resolve began to form. I wasn't just leaving. I was retreating to find the weapons I needed to burn Bennett's lies to the ground. The mahogany-lined office of Felix Sterling smelled of expensive tobacco and old law books, a stark contrast to the dust and betrayal I had left behind at the Harrington farm. Felix had been my mother's closest confidant long before he became the family's estate attorney, and the look of grim determination on his face as I explained Lawrence's actions told me he wasn't surprised. He didn't offer me platitudes or empty comfort. Instead, he pulled a weathered, wax-sealed file from a floor-to-ceiling safe in the corner. Your mother, Pearl, was a woman who understood the volatility of men like Lawrence, Felix said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. She knew that his guilt for the past could one day outweigh his common sense. That's why she placed a very specific safety net under this estate, one that your father has conveniently forgotten. I leaned over the desk as Felix spread out the original land deeds and the prenuptial agreement Lawrence had signed 30 years ago. My heart skipped a beat as I read the ironclad continuity clause. Pearl hadn't just left the farm to Lawrence, she had left it to him in trust, contingent upon the preservation of the Harrington bloodline's direct involvement in the management. If the primary heir, meaning me, was ever removed without a documented, legally binding cause of gross negligence, the ownership of the land would immediately revert to my maternal grandparents, Dorothy and Walter. The missing $5,000 Bennett had planted was his attempt to create that gross negligence, but he had failed to realize that Felix required a forensic audit before any such claim could stand in court. But the financial trap was only the beginning of what Felix had uncovered. While I was struggling to pay the grain bills, Bennett Miller had been living a double life. Felix handed me a stack of grainy photographs and bank statements from an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Bennett hasn't just been managing the horses, Cassidy. He's been using the Harrington name and the farm's credit lines to back illegal high-stakes gambling rings in the underground racing circuit. The records showed that over $300,000 had been siphoned off through shell companies, explaining the shortages I had been blamed for. Bennett wasn't just a greedy opportunist. He was a parasite bleeding the estate dry to fund a gambling addiction that would have eventually led the federal authorities straight to our front door. The final blow, however, was a private investigator's report tucked into the back of the file. My father believed he was repaying a debt to an old military friend, but the DNA profiles told a different story. Bennett's father wasn't a fallen hero. He was a con artist who had spent years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud. More shockingly, the report suggested that Bennett's mother was a woman Lawrence had briefly been in. The report suggested that Bennett's mother was a woman Lawrence had briefly been involved with during a separation from Pearl decades ago. Bennett wasn't an adopted son out of charity. He was a calculated plant, an illegitimate son who had been coached from birth to infiltrate our lives and seize the inheritance he felt he was owed. He had played on Lawrence's deepest insecurities and buried guilt to stage a hostile takeover from within. "He's not just taking the farm, Cassidy," Felix whispered, his eyes burning with a cold, legal fury. "He's committing grand larceny and identity fraud. If we take this to the county sheriff now, he'll run. We need to let him think he's won until the moment the ink is dry on that new will." I sat back, the weight of the revelation settling into my bones like ice. I wasn't just a daughter fighting for her home anymore. I was a Harrington, protecting a legacy from a predator who shared my father's blood, but none of his honor. The plan was clear. I would return to Lexington not as a beggar, but as the executioner of Bennett's ambitions. The heavy oak doors of the Harrington Library swung shut, sealing the five of us, Lawrence, Bennett, Felix Sterling, a county sheriff's deputy, and myself, into a room that felt like a pressure cooker. This was the moment I had envisioned since the night I was forced into the mud of our driveway. My father, Lawrence Harrington, sat at the head of the table, his hand resting on the shoulder of Bennett Miller with a paternal pride that turned my stomach. The new will, the one that stripped me of my birthright and handed the keys of Pearl's legacy to a stranger, lay open between us. Bennett leaned back, his smug, practiced grin failing to hide the twitch in his left eye as he watched Felix open his briefcase. "You're making a mistake, Cassidy," Bennett said, his voice dripping with a fake, oily concern. "We could have handled this quietly, but you just had to drag the law into a family matter." He thought he was untouchable because he had Lawrence's signature, but he didn't realize that a signature obtained through fraud is nothing more than ink on a dead page. I didn't respond to his taunt. Instead, I looked directly at my father, who was staring at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "Dad, I'm giving you one last chance to look at the man standing next to you for who he really is, not who you want him to be." Lawrence just sighed, shaking his head. "Enough, Cassidy. Sign the waiver for the jewelry and the cash, and let's end this circus." That was when I pulled the notarized sheet of paper from my blazer, the same one that had made my father freeze in the opening moments of this nightmare. I laid it over the new will, but this time, I didn't stop there. I signaled to Felix, who began spreading the forensic audit and the investigator's report across the mahogany surface. "That's not just a dechook, Dad. It's a confession," I said, my voice steady and cold. I pointed to the bank statements from the Cayman Islands, highlighting the $300,000 siphoned from the Harrington Medical Fund. Bennett's face drained of color as the sheriff's deputy stepped closer, his hand resting on his belt. "The gambling rings, the illegal betting on our own stallions, the high-stakes debt that Bennett had accumulated in my father's name, it was all laid bare in black and white. The room went silent as Lawrence began to read the report on Bennett's true identity. He saw the photos of the con artist father and the DNA profile that shattered the lie of the military hero's son. My father's hand started to shake, the paper rattling against the table, as the truth finally broke through the wall of his denial. He looked at Bennett, searching for a denial, but the young man's smugness had evaporated, replaced by a desperate, feral look of a trapped animal. "You lied to me," Lawrence whispered, his voice cracking like dry timber. "Everything you told me about your father, about your loyalty to this farm. It was all a game to get the land." I didn't feel a sense of triumph as I watched my father's world crumble. I only felt a grim sense of duty. I turned to Bennett, whose eyes were darting toward the door. "You thought I was just a girl with a calculator, Bennett. You thought because I cared about the history of this place, circuit of this area of this place, I was too weak to protect it." I then played the final card, the original trust document from my mother, Pearl. I explained the ironclad continuity clause that Felix had found, the one that rendered any will signed by Lawrence null and void the moment he attempted to remove me without cause. Because of Bennett's fraud, the ownership of the Harrington farm didn't just stay with me, it had already legally reverted to my grandparents, Dorothy and Walter. The moment Lawrence signed that fake dechook 6 months ago, Bennett hadn't just failed to steal the farm, he had accidentally triggered the very mechanism that stripped Lawrence of his power as well. The predator was now penniless, and the man who had enabled him was left with nothing but the ash of his own poor choices.